Alright, so we are on to some of these cultural phenomena that we wanted to talk about. Um, we did we talked about classifications of culture and forms of culture and the characteristics of culture. Um, so we have next the educational implications. Cultures differ, and no one culture can be judged on the basis of another. So you can't fairly say, you know, X culture is doing something wrong or inefficiently or ineffectively if you're judging that on the standards of a different culture because of the idiosyncrasies and uniqueness of each individual culture. So when we talk about culture and cultural differences and different cultures interacting, one of the major topics, of course, especially in the Caribbean, is prejudice. And so, to in order to avoid prejudice, um, you have to have contact between cultures. The way that people become prejudiced or judgmental or xenophobic is by a lack of contact with other people, whether it's another racial group or another religious group or another linguistic group, um, or another a group with differing economic interests or competing economic interests. Tolerance is fostered by contact between cultures, and of course, there are some times where contact between cultures has the opposite effect, but naturalistic contact between cultures leads to tolerance and multicultural society. Globalization and amalgamation of culture is also one of the big things that we are definitely going to talk about later on in the syllabus. But this concept of amalgamation of culture basically refers to a loss of uniqueness of cultures, a loss of individuality of cultures. So instead of the people in this part of the world doing things one way and the people in another part of the world doing things another way, because of the impacts of rampant economic and political globalization, what you get is everybody doing things the same way, and it's it's never something that was mutually agreed upon. It is in most cases a kind of hegemonic um, colonial way that it has happened. So in this era, it's the U.S. imperialism that is the most prevalent. Okay, next up, any questions about these implications of culture? Cool. Um, Functions of culture. This is an interesting one, and this is an important one to take note of for the philosophy and the political theory of it. So, culture has been theorized by various thinkers to be a means of social control, and specifically control of people's behavior. It also functions for communication. It functions to establish ethical standards, and it functions to have a system by which um, you can have anticipation of reaction. Basically, you want to be able to predict or anticipate how an individual or a group or the entire society will react or respond to any given phenomenon. And it's a lot easier to do that when you have the context of a culture. So, as an example, there are certain things that might fly in Barbados that, if it happened in a place like Trinidad or Guyana or Jamaica, um, would not go down so easily. And that has to do with the culture. And of course, since it's a Caribbean culture you're talking about, you always, always, always have to go back to the um, tumultuous historical roots of the Caribbean. So, as I mentioned in the first class that we had, um, Barbados is different from other Caribbean um, territories and Caribbean islands because of its unique demographic makeup and its unique colonial history, whereas the other islands had some competition colonially speaking. So sometimes it was the French, sometimes it was the Spanish, and sometimes it was the English, and there was conflict or contest over which colonial power would have control of the islands. And because those islands also had the indigenous people were there when the Europeans got there, so that was an additional interaction between groups of people. And the immigration schemes after slavery ended, the East Indians and the Chinese going into those islands created another layer of social interaction and another opportunity for cultural phenomena and societal phenomena to emerge. Barbados, not having had any of that, Barbados was kind of known to have the most brutal system of slavery in the Caribbean. A lot of Caribbean territories, for example, had slave codes. In the Spanish territories, they had a code called Las Siete Partidas, the seven articles, which is their slave code for how you were legally allowed to treat slaves ethically. And in the French colonies, they had what was called the Code Noir, which is just the black code or the black law for how you were allowed to treat the slaves. The English didn't really have an equivalent to that. They had something, but it was not equivalent to how are you supposed to treat slaves, because treatment of slaves is just not something that the British were um, focused on. Barbados, its geographic location, also contributed to this specific brutality and I guess it being like the worst place to be a slave, because what happened was Barbados was the gateway to the Western Hemisphere into the Caribbean. So there were multiple triangles in what is typically called the triangular slave trade. And it's a misnomer to say triangular slave trade because, again, there were multiple triangles. The Portuguese had one, the Spanish had one, the French had one, and the English had one. But the British, I should say, the British triangle, it came from wherever it came from in West Africa, and the port of entry to the Caribbean was Barbados because it's the easternmost island. It's right in the Atlantic, and it provides a nice bay to go off into a route to any of the other Caribbean islands or territories. And so Barbados got the first pick of the slaves, which means that the most it was the most valuable auctions that were happening here, and of course these planters and the slave owners with the most money and the most power to throw around would have been buying their slaves in Barbados. And so that what that led to was the again, since they have the most power and the most money to throw around, the most resources to contribute to this system of enslavement, Barbados was the most brutal, and I put successful in quotes because, you know, as far as the British were concerned, what their intention was with the slave trade and, the production that they were attempting to get by means of slavery, that was, they would have said, the most successful in Barbados. Barbados was called the jewel in the British crown, the gem of the Caribbean. It was Britain's favorite son as a colony, and that led to the slaves in Barbados being a lot less um, rebellious. There were a lot less slave revolts in Barbados than there were in other places. There were still some, but they were just less of them, and successful slave revolts just didn't have a chance of happening in Barbados, again because of its unique demography, geography, its place in the political and economic structure of the British Empire and the triangular trade made Barbados that kind of society, and that the result that that had on its people um, meant that this goes back to anticipation of reaction, the kind of slave revolt that you might expect in a place like Jamaica or Trinidad, you would not have expected. Well, I say Trinidad. Trinidad has different history with British slavery, but in some of the other British Caribbean colonies where they had slavery, the reaction that you might get to certain moves in those other territories, you would not get in Barbados because of the um, unique, I guess, zeitgeist, the general psyche of the people of Barbados. And because of that, Barbados was the place that you went if you wanted a police force, enforcers, slaves whose job it was to keep other slaves in line and to enforce and to perpetuate on the ground, in the field, and in the mills and factories and whatnot, the order and the discipline of slavery. You went to Barbados because of the conditioning of the people. So that's the functions of culture. Social control, specifically, controlling people's behavior. Communication, up, establishing and upholding and enforcing ethical standards, and for anticipation of reaction. Stop me whenever you do have a question. But we'll just go on to um, society, because we've been talking about culture a lot. And I've also mentioned society a lot. And they are inextricably linked, really. They're coexistent. You really can't have one without another. But a society is a group of people occupying a territory, united in purpose, goals, and objectives. So, cultures exist within societies, and a society has a culture. And the distinction between culture and society is important. The society is more about the people themselves, whereas the culture is more about how the people live, their behavior. So I guess society answers the question who and what, whereas culture answers the question how and why. So that's society and culture. Yeah, society exists of people, while culture is the idea and the customs and so on, but they are coexistent. And as we're talking about culture and society, there are a lot of keywords that it's important to pay attention to, both for concepts to be mindful of when you're writing your essays, and also to be very familiar with the definition of these words and the distinction um, that of one word from another when you're doing your multiple choice exam, and to be able to properly identify these terms and the nuances of these terms on a multiple choice exam. That really does play a huge part. It's a make or break kind of thing. So you may want to take notes, write these down. Assimilation, diffusion, acculturation, transculturation, culture shock, ethnocentrism, and cultural relativism. I'll go again. Assimilation, diffusion, DIFF, diffusion, acculturation, it's two C's in acculturation, transculturation, culture shock, and ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So, that's a lot of terms, and we will define them. First one, assimilation. It's a pretty, the word assimilation. Just we're just applying it to the specific study and theory of culture and society. So assimilation, in this sense, refers to when a particular aspect, some cultural feature or some cultural phenomenon or idea, or even a person or people a way of thinking, a religion, a dance, a word, a language is added to an existing culture. And we talked before about the difference between um, stable and unstable cultures, where stable cultures integrate elements into them smoothly, whereas unstable cultures are shaken up and rattled by the introduction of new features, new cultural elements into the culture. And so something like assimilation is what you expect to happen in stable cultures, where the introduction of a new element does not necessitate the deconstruction and rebuilding, restructuring entirely of the society and its culture. You can just assimilate the language or the people or the food, the economic structure or the crop or the livestock into the culture. Diffusion refers to when um, so again, you know the word fusion. It's something going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. In this context, diffusion refers to a particular cultural element going from being niche or part of a specific subculture or not widely adopted or not widely part of the culture to spreading throughout the society and becoming more widely adopted, more, as they say, mainstream. Acculturation, yeah, no problem. A diffusion is the process of a cultural element going from being niche or part of a subculture to being widely adopted, widely accepted, mainstream, part of the broader, more general culture, not belonging to one specific group or subculture, but um, being adopted more widely by the larger society. Is that clear? Cool. Acculturation is the process of something. Um, okay, how do I explain this one now? It's probably better to explain this one with an example. Um, so whereas assimilation, when we talked about assimilation, we talked about a cultural element um, being integrated into a culture. Acculturation is kind of the same idea, but um, it is kind of from the other side of it. So if a person goes to a different culture or a group of people move into a different place and they are themselves adapting to the culture that they are now interacting with, that's acculturation. So if there's a large group of migrants from China or Syria or Ethiopia, and they go to the United States of America or to the UK for some reason, some whatever the political reason is, they all move out. Their acculturation is the process of them learning English, getting used to the cuisine, getting used to, if they're in the United States of America, getting used to the tipping culture. If they are in the UK, getting used to the queuing culture, the public transportation, things like that. That's acculturation, is the assimilation into um, usually the dominant culture. Next, we have transculturation, which is the changing of a particular cultural element. Um, Again, example is probably good here. It's cultural transformation that has to do with an influx. It says here an influx of new culture elements and the loss or alteration of existing ones. Um, and so again, this you might think of those last two terms, acculturation and transculturation, as elements of stable or unstable cultures. So if this group of Ethiopian immigrants going to the US, they fit into the culture well, they assimilate into the culture, they kind of become naturalized Americans, not by citizenship, but in terms of their culture. How well do they learn English? How heavy is their accent when they speak to people? Um, how well do they know the lay of the land? How well do they know the customs and the culture? You're looking at acculturation, whereas transculturation happens when these people move in and the city that they're in. So sorry about that. I lost connection. Um, just check this is still recording. Yes, it is. Cool. Right. So, transculturation happens when this hypothetical group of Ethiopian immigrants moves into a U.S. city and they open a restaurant where they are serving their own cuisine that is not a part of the American palate. They set up their own church, of course, and it's not a part of the American religious melting pot. They start manufacturing their own clothes, which are not a part of American fashion, and this community slowly becomes um, a hybrid community that is kind of a little Ethiopia in America. It happens a lot with the Chinese. It happens with, for example, Syrian immigrants. Um, there are a lot of these communities from various parts of Asia that when they move to a place, this transculturation happens, and they alter the culture when they come. So they don't just assimilate into the culture. It's not an acculturation. They and it's not exactly their culture just being like picked up and put down somewhere else because there's American Chinese food and there's Chinese food. There's American Mexican food and there's Mexican food, and those are not the same thing. American Chinese food is its own distinct, unique cultural entity, cultural element, and it's not that they are, not authentic. They go to the US and suddenly they lose what makes them them. They lose their way. They lose their culture. No. What it is cultures adapt. And cultures adapt to their environment, their society, their surroundings. And so the ingredients that they have available to them, the palates of Americans are not particularly suited to certain kinds or certain features of Chinese cuisine. And so Chinese American food, in order to survive, has to take on a different character from Chinese food, and you get transculturation. Culture shock is a relatively simple term to explain. It's the negative um, reaction of cultural elements or members of cultures that are not naturally coexistent, um, coming to coexist with each other, and yeah, it's a kind of explosive. It's a shock. It's not so much a surprise necessarily, but it's like I have a great example of this. Friend of mine, she is from Eritrea, and when she came to Barbados for the first time, she found that people found her impolite. They thought she was rude, and it was because when she would speak to them, she would not look them in the eye. Where she's from, in Eritrea, you don't look people in the eye. Certainly not people who are in authority over you, or in some way your elder or your superior or your senior. You don't look people straight in the eye. That would be disrespectful. Whereas in Barbados, she found that it was exactly the opposite, that it's disrespectful to people if you don't look them in the eye. And so that, for her, was a culture shock. A culture shock is not specific to individuals. Culture shock can also be an entire group of people who they experience an element of a culture that they are moving into, or even an element of culture that has come to them, and it's a culture shock to them. Um, there are probably quite a few good examples that you can find of people's stories of and their experiences of not just them being shocked by the culture that they moved into, let's say in the United States of America, but the Americans having the same culture shock when interacting with them. Ethnocentrism is the idea or the way of doing things by which um, it's an ethnocentric. It's centered around a specific. Question. What's the main thing that differentiates acculturation and transculturation? Acculturation happens when um, people assimilate into the culture um, in a stable way. So you become a naturalized American or a naturalized um, Englishman or whatever. Whereas transculturation happens when you, instead of assimilating into that culture, you alter that culture. And so instead of a Chinese person going to the United States and becoming, um, culturally speaking, an American person who is just, you know, from China, so they look different and maybe they sound different, but they are culturally American. Versus transculturation is Chinese people coming to America and instead of eating American food and wearing American clothes and patronizing American businesses, they set up their own businesses, they wear their own clothes, and they make their own food. And it isn't, again, it's not the same as it was in the culture that they came from, but it is an alteration. It changes the culture that they come into. Acculturation does not change the culture that you come into, whereas transculturation does. It adds new elements and it causes elements to be lost. Does that make sense? Cool. No problem. So right, ethnocentrism. It's centric or centered around a specific ethnicity. Um, yeah, this is something that Caribbean people are probably very familiar with. Ethnocentrism does not necessarily just mean race, black or white or um, Hispanic or Indian or Chinese. In a lot of places in the world, ethnocentrism manifests itself in more subtle ways. So, for example, you have a lot of different ethnic groups living in China, but because of the history of because of Chinese history, because of the most successful Chinese dynasty having been the Qing. It's called China, named after that dynasty, and not named after the Tang or the Han or any of the other dynasties that at various times had control in China. And the language is the language of one specific ethnic group that has become the official language of the country. And the other ethnic groups will probably still speak their language, but because the official language of their country is Mandarin, um, that's, I guess you could say, an example of ethnocentrism manifesting itself. It's not necessarily uh, a negative thing. People can accept things like that. That's just how human society works. But it is one of the ways that you can demonstrate a phenomenon such as ethnocentrism. But there are much more blatant and much more nasty and negative examples. So you have cases like in the United States of America, where you have signs up on doors and walls of and windows of places of business saying Irish need not apply or Italians need not apply because the they don't want these specific ethnicities of people in their community. They're very xenophobic and very ethnocentric. And it's also enshrined in a lot of laws. A lot of the policies in the United States of America for a very long time were very explicit in terms of how they codified race into the law. You had to be of a specific race to legally do this or that, or to live in a specific area. You couldn't be black, you had to be Caucasian. Um, yeah, there's a lot, and it's depressing, but important to recognize because it is a part of the culture of the Western world that has this history of colonialism and imperialism built upon race. It's ethnocentric in its nature. And finally, cultural relativism is the approach, the philosophy, the theory of culture that looks at the differences between culture and does not try to compare them on any um, objective measure, but can only really compare them as peers. So that might be confusing, but just for an example of this, talking about what is developmentally appropriate for children. Some cultures have different perceptions of what a child is, what it means to be a child, and what it is appropriate for children to do and for children not to do. And so, when you talk about what is developmentally appropriate for children, when you talk about, for example, the idea of child labor as something that is not good, just flat out child labor, children working is not good. And if a child has to work, it's because of some societal failure, and that like ideally, if the society allowed for it, children would not work. And that idea exists in one culture, but in another culture, no. You are part of the family. It's how your parents eat, and it's how you eat. It's the thing that you do. Your family has this business, you help out. Your family has a farm. You're 3 years old. You can walk. You can hold a rope. You understand what's going on. You can take the sheep out to pasture. You can feed the chickens. You can collect eggs. You can go into the market and sell your mother or your father's wares because you are a part of the family and the family's work is your work. Being a child does not preclude you from working, and it's certainly not seen as some sort of ill or some negative thing that children work in their parents' business. And so that is an example where cultural relativism has to be used in order to assess what is appropriate for children in different cultures. So, for example, if you do a test, a psychological test, I'm studying psychology, so that's where I'm going to go to just off the top of my head. But if you're conducting a psychological test on children and you get differing attitudes about work or about the nature of responsibility, it might be troubling, yes, if a child in the United States answers a certain way, but if a child in a different culture answers a certain way, then you have to realize cultural relativism. This is normal and acceptable, and this is how things work in this culture. And there are certain things that The idea of relativism, moral relativism especially, is a difficult one because the objectivity or subjectivity of morality, that's a whole philosophical question. This isn't a philosophy course, but there are some things that you have to look at through the lens and the theory of cultural relativism. We have 3 minutes before our meeting runs out of time. If there are any questions, I'll take them. If not, I'll end this and just reopen the Zoom so you guys can jump right back in and we don't run out of time in the middle of a sentence. You have any questions about the keywords that we just did? Okay. All right. So I'll close this and reopen it so you guys can jump right back in. All right, we're back. Wonderful. Next topic, we're looking at characteristics of Caribbean culture. And we have some key terms, some more key terms. Norms, animism, sanctions, socialization, and Marxism. Norms just refers to anything that it is normal or generally accepted to do or say or think or be in a specific culture. Animism is a not always religious, but a lot of times it manifests itself as religious um, belief or an attribution of qualities of living things to inanimate objects. And because it was an element of the West African religions that the people who came would have had um, experience with or access to, along with, in a lot of cases, the Islam that they were exposed to as well. Remember, they had a lot of syncretic religion in West Africa. It was not, exactly halal, but they had Islam, they had the teachings and the theology of Islam, but they mixed it with a lot of the practices of the religions that they had before that. Um, and so animism is one of those things that stuck through the Islamic empire's move into North and West Africa, and it stuck into the formation of Caribbean culture. Um, Sanctions. So sanctions are simply rewards and punishments for conformity or non-conformity. So you can have positive or negative sanctions. You can say that a behavior is sanctioned by the community, or you can say that somebody puts sanctions in place to stop someone from accessing some resources or engaging in some behavior. Sanctions are just how the society rewards or punishes conformity or non-conformity. Sanctions are just rewards or punishments in general. But in the context of culture and society, it's about conformity to societal norms and societal rules or non-conformity to them. That's you either get rewarded or punished. Sanctions. Socialization refers to, it doesn't have to be so technical. Socialization is the way that people are taught to be, not explicitly, sometimes explicitly, but largely simply by their living in the society and absorbing the concepts, the norms, the values, the mores of a society. It's the way that people in that society, members of that society, and especially the young members of that society, in any form of education, learn how to be. They learn how to be citizens. They learn how to interact with their fellow members of the society. That's all that is socialization. So, as an example, if you live in a society where um, someone pursuing a romantic relationship expects that if they are a man, it's their job to be the one who asks a woman or initiates a romantic relationship, and if they are a woman, they expect that that's not something that they would do. That's an example of them having been socialized into that behavior or into that way of thinking about relationships. And finally, Marxism. So, Marxism, of course, named after Karl Marx, is a philosophy that we don't go fully into in this syllabus. You will come across it, so you'll learn a lot about Marxism by contact with it. But this syllabus doesn't formally study Marxism. But Marxism is very important to have an awareness of because of its importance in the context of Caribbean culture, Caribbean history, and specifically Caribbean governance and movements towards independence and self-governance. Um, Labor unions and labor party. Marxism, just briefly, is um, well, okay. So there's Marxism, there's socialism, there's communism. There are three terms that tend to get thrown around a lot, and they're similar both in their function and in their origin, and so it's important to distinguish between them. But Marxism is just the ideas, the beliefs, the philosophical teachings of Karl Marx, and they have to do with the means of production. Um, and that's what it's about. It's a labor theory. And so the means of production simply means however things get made, however things get produced. The means of production refers to how food is grown or farmed. The means of production refers to how clothes are sewn, who is making clothes, who is building houses, who's building roads, things like that. Things, products, and services that a society needs and are part of the functions of a society. All of that is the production and the means of production is how those things get made. And Marxism is all about distributing means of production so that it is as widespread as possible. Um, And that's the difference between socialism and capitalism, where socialism is the philosophy of socialism is that the means of production should be as widely distributed as possible. Capitalism is the idea that the means of production should be um, a free for all. It should be on an open and free market, and anyone and everyone should have a chance to essentially be the owner of that market. Capitalism says that if you can, you should. Might makes right in an economic theory, whereas socialism says there's a specific should, and so whether or not you can, this is what you should, and the should kind of regulates what certain people or certain groups can. So socialism, specifically Marxism. Okay, we'll get to the key terms of Marxism. So there's this term here, the bourgeoisie. I'll spell that Bourgeoisie. Again, Bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie. It's a French term. It comes from the French, and it's the same place that we get the word bougie in modern English. And the bourgeoisie, according to Karl Marx, is the social group who owns the means of production and tends to exploit the underclass. And so the reason that it's so important to have an understanding of and an appreciation for um, Marxism, these labor theories, is because, as I will keep saying, the history of the Caribbean is the history of exploitation of people's labor. And so these labor theories become very, very important to talking about, thinking about, studying the Caribbean. Um, and so the Caribbean has a great, you know, pretty obvious example of who is the bourgeoisie, the social group who owns the means of production and tends to exploit the underclass. You go the logical extreme of that, and you get British chattel slavery, plantation economy, plantation society. That's it. Capitalists. The capitalists are the class who owns the most wealth and the means of production. So capitalism is a philosophy, an economic philosophy, yes. And the capitalists, according to Marx, refers to the class who owns the most wealth and the means of production. And so it's concentrated in a very small number of people. It's what we call an oligarchy, which is another term that it's important to know if you're thinking or talking about the Caribbean. Oligarchy um, comes from, well, it's the origin of the word is not important. Oligarchy simply means a small group of people being in charge of something. As long as it's a small group of people being in charge, proportionally small, of course. So, like, if there's an organization and it has 10 people and there are 3 people in charge, that's hardly an oligarchy. But in the case of Barbados or any of the other Caribbean territories that we have population statistics on, we can see the vast um, outnumbering of white planters who have the power and own the means of production, and how outnumbered they are by the African slaves who they exploit. These slaves don't own any wealth, and they don't own the means of production. They may have some influence and some control over it, and that they use that as methods of resistance, but they don't own the means of production. And so the capitalists do. And in a capitalist society, now I have to say there's no such thing as a truly capitalist, like fully 100% capitalist or fully 100% communist or socialist society um, on Earth. People have tried, and people are kind of close. You might say the United States of America is hyper capitalist, and while that's true, it has some socialist features like welfare systems and so on. It's regulated capitalism, really, and there's not really a true communist or socialist um, society on Earth. You might think of the typical example, Russia being a communist country, but Russian. There's been a lot of talk about the Russian oligarchs and Russian oligarchy um, since the invasion and the beginning of the war in Ukraine, because yeah, Russia may claim to have communist philosophy as one of the principles by which it is structured, but really and truly, the power in Russia is concentrated in proportionally what is a very, very, very small percentage of the people. And that is an oligarchy, and that's capitalism. Plantocracy. This is the next term. The plantocracy is a ruling class, political order, or government composed of or dominated by the planter class. So a plantocracy is what you get when in your society, um, it's a largely agrarian or agricultural society, but it is an oligarchy, and so you have people owning plantations, owning the land on which crops are grown, owning the crops, owning the again, it's all about who owns the means of production. Um, and in this case, it's specifically focused on agriculture. That's the plantocracy. And in the Caribbean, we have lots of experience with plantocracy, of course. The next term is intelligentsia, which is just the English word intelligent with an SIA on the end. And the intelligentsia is the social class of intellectuals or highly educated people as a group, and especially when regarded as possessing culture and political influence. So that's when there's a social group who is defined by their intellectualism or high levels of education, and usually and especially, this group is regarded as the group who possesses culture. So a very good example is these society of Britain under the Norman invasion. So under Norman control, I should say. So just to sum it up, the Normans are a group of Latinate people who precede and are the proto French, you might say. Normans are Old French, and Saxons are Old English. And the reason that we have different words for animals and the food that those animals become when you kill them and cook them and put them on a plate is because the language that was used by the Normans, them being the rich people, the people with class, as they say, and power and control and political influence and culture, culture in quotation marks, everyone has culture, but because these are the people who interact with these animals by eating them, the words that they have, the French boeuf becomes beef. The French you get venison for deer. You get poule. The French word poule becomes the English poultry. Um, Whereas the people who are interacting with these animals in the field, when they are animals on a farm, it's animal husbandry. Um, these are the people who do not have this political power and influence and so on. And so the words for them that come from the Saxon language or these Germanic languages, you get ku becoming the English word cow as opposed to the French boeuf um, being for beef. You get um, chicken for the animal rather than the French derived or the Latin derived poultry for the meat. So that's just an example of the intelligentsia and the way that intelligentsia manifests itself in various cultures and societies. We will stop there. We'll move on to um, cultural diversity and specifically talk about hybridization next week. And hybridization is, I would say, one of the most important cultural topics to pay attention to when you're talking about the Caribbean. Any questions before we close off for today? Afternoon. This class starts at 4. It's for 1 hour and we're wrapping up now. Well, as it's 4 Eastern Caribbean time. If you're in Jamaica, it starts at 3. Yes, only on Wednesdays. There are others, but I only teach on Wednesdays. If there are no other questions, I'll just stop the recording.